The Sumerian King List is not a myth. It is an administrative record, copied by scribes across 1,000 years, used by historians as a chronology of Mesopotamia. It names 5 cities. It names 8 kings. Then the list breaks. One line. Then the flood swept over. Nothing more. Modern scholarship reads that line as a boundary, legend on one side, history on the other. But the list never says the cities were destroyed. It says the world changed. And if 5 named cities did not vanish, but went somewhere the record could no longer follow, then 6 places, not 5, may still be waiting underground. The Sumerian King List exists in more than one physical copy, different sites, different scribes, centuries apart, and they agree with each other almost word for word. That agreement is the detail historians keep returning to. A forgery does not survive multiple independent copies with matching structure. A working administrative record does. The list was not composed as literature. It was composed the way a government composes a registry. Who ruled, where, for how long, and in what order. Scholars at institutions including the University of Pennsylvania and Oxford have treated it for over a century as the closest thing Mesopotamia left behind to an official chronology of its own earliest period. Copies have surfaced at Nippur, at Lhasa, at Kish. The most complete version, the Well-Blundell Prism, sits catalogued in Oxford's Ashmolean Museum, dated to roughly 1800 BCE, but understood by its own internal structure to be transmitting material far older than its own writing surface. None of these copies were composed for an audience seeking myth. They were composed for scribal schools, for temple archives, for the kind of institutional memory that needed kingship itself to be traceable, lineage by lineage, the same way grain shipments and labour rosters needed to be traceable. The form is bureaucratic. What sits inside that bureaucratic form is the part nobody has fully explained. The list opens before any flood is mentioned. It names a sequence of cities, each one holding kingship in turn, as if authority itself were a physical object, passed from place to place rather than a title held by one location indefinitely. Eridu holds it first, then it moves. Bad Tibira holds it next. Then it moves again, to Larak, then to Sippar, then to Shuruppak. 5 cities, 8 kings, distributed across them unevenly, some cities holding several rulers, others only one. The text does not explain why kingship moved. It only records that it did, the way a registry records a transfer without explaining the reasoning behind it. What makes scholars uneasy is not the movement, it is the numbers attached to each reign. The list assigns these 8 kings reign lengths in the tens of thousands of years, figures no historian accepts as literal human lifespans. The standard explanation is that the numbers are symbolic, built on the Mesopotamian sexagesimal counting system, encoding something other than elapsed time, perhaps status, perhaps the size of an administrative unit, perhaps a calendar function lost to us. No consensus exists. What does exist is agreement that the scribes who copied these numbers, generation after generation, were not careless. Cuneiform administrative texts are not careless documents. Grain counts in temple records from the same culture are accurate to the litre, labour rosters accurate to the individual worker, tax records accurate to the unit of barley owed. Errors drift between copies. These numbers do not drift. They repeat almost exactly every time the list is recopied. The numbers mean something. Nobody has agreed on what. And then, after the 8th king, after the 5th city, the list breaks. The Well-Blundell Prism states it in a single line, translated by multiple independent Assyriologists with only minor variation in phrasing. Then the flood swept over, no description follows, no wave, no rain, no duration. The list simply restarts afterward with a new sequence of cities and kings, as if continuing a registry after an interruption, rather than beginning a new story after an ending. Modern scholarship reads this break as a boundary, the line where Mesopotamian tradition itself separates a legendary pre-flood age from a historical post-flood age. That reading is not wrong, it is incomplete. The phrase rendered as swept over does not specify destruction the way later flood narratives specify it. It does not describe drowning. It does not describe cities being broken apart or buried under sediment. It describes an event passing across the land, after which the list simply changes register. The cities are not narrated as destroyed. They are narrated as absent from what follows. That absence is the detail this account is built around. 5 cities held kingship before the break. 8 kings ruled across them. After the break, none of those 5 names appear again as seats of kingship, anywhere in the surviving versions of the list. Not destroyed, not mourned, not named again, in any form under any title. A registry that tracked the movement of authority with administrative precision, city by city, simply stops tracking those 5 cities the moment the floodline appears. Either the cities were erased so completely that an institution built on preserving names had nothing left to record, or the cities continued to exist in some form the registry was no longer designed to track. Either explanation should unsettle anyone treating the list as a tidy record of decline, because both require the same scribes who counted barley to the litre to have simply stopped counting all at once for 5 places at the same time. This account follows the second possibility, expanded one step further than the list itself goes. The King List preserves 5 named cities before the break. What follows here treats that number as a floor, not a ceiling, and proposes a 6th location bound to the same event by function rather than by name. A city the official record never listed because its purpose was never administrative in the first place. Together, 6 locations, each carrying a distinct role, form the structure of what comes next. One tied to kingship itself, one tied to priesthood, one tied to water, one tied to fire, one tied to the warning that preceded the flood, and one sealed for a reason no surviving text was ever permitted to preserve. None of these 6 are myths invented for this account. Each is built from a documented gap, a real silence in the archaeological and textual record at a location where Sumerian habitation is confirmed, but where continuity after the flood layer is not. The pattern is consistent enough, across enough sites, that the question stops being whether something was lost and becomes a different question entirely. Lost where? Not gone. Lost. The King List ends a sequence with 8 kings and 5 cities, and a line that explains nothing about what came after. What follows treats that ending as an opening instead, the first visible seam in a structure that was built deliberately to survive being forgotten. The first of the 6 is the city the King List itself begins with. Eridu held kingship before any other place is named. Tradition treated it as the oldest seat of authority in the land, the place where kingship was said to have descended in the first instance, lowered from somewhere above rather than seized or inherited in the ordinary human way. What the official record does not preserve is what happened to that seat once kingship moved away from it. A registry can record a transfer of title without recording what became of the building the title once occupied. Excavated levels at the site, reaching down through more than a dozen distinct construction phases, show temple foundations sealed and built over repeatedly across centuries, each new structure raised directly on top of the one before it rather than beside it. Archaeologists call this a tell, a mound formed by a city rebuilding itself on its own ruins again and again rather than relocating to fresh ground. This account treats that layering as more than ordinary rebuilding. It proposes a structure beneath the visible temple mound, a chamber the texts refer to obliquely as the Gipirig, the reed-sealed enclosure, a phrase that appears in fragmentary administrative contexts with no clear ritual or agricultural explanation attached to it. If kingship was treated as a transferable office rather than a fixed inheritance, then the apparatus of governance, the records, the regalia, the lines of succession would have needed somewhere stable and secret to be kept whenever the title itself moved elsewhere. A throne does not have to be occupied to be preserved. It only has to be kept somewhere kingship could return to, should the surface ever stop being survivable. The Gipirig in this reading is not a tomb, not a shrine. It is a vault for continuity itself, built to outlast whichever city happened to hold the title at any given moment. The second city is tied not to kingship but to priesthood, and its function is different in kind. Temples in early Mesopotamia were not simply places of worship. They were administrative centers, granaries, archives, and observatories combined into a single institution. The closest thing the period had to a university and a bank operating under one roof. The temple platform visible above ground, the ziggurat in its later form, was never the whole structure. Foundation deposits at multiple sites show chambers beneath the platform itself, sealed at construction and never reopened, containing inscribed tablets, model tools, and in some cases nothing retrievable at all, just empty cut stone where something was clearly meant to sit before it was removed, or before it was never placed at all and the chamber was left waiting. Standard interpretation treats these as ritual deposits, a ceremonial gesture with no practical function beyond consecration. This account treats the pattern as something closer to a vault for the priesthood's working knowledge, the calendar calculations, the astronomical observations, the liturgical sequence that kept ritual time itself synchronized, sealed below the platform the way a backup copy is kept apart from the original. The term used in temple administrative texts for this kind of sealed substructure is ikigal, the great house below, a phrase otherwise reserved in later periods for the underworld itself. The overlap is not incidental. If priesthood's role was to maintain ritual continuity against any disruption, including a disruption severe enough to interrupt the visible temple above, then a duplicate structure beneath it, holding the knowledge required to resume ritual practice from nothing, is exactly what an institution built around continuity would be expected to construct. The temple above could fall. The function carried out beneath it would not need to. The third city is tied to water. Of the three covered so far, it leaves the clearest physical trace, the kind of evidence that does not depend on interpreting an ambiguous phrase, but can be measured directly with a tape and a level. Southern Mesopotamia's water table sits close to the surface. An excavation at several early sites has uncovered stone-lined channels running beneath structures that show no surface irrigation use, channels too deep and too enclosed for ordinary field watering, connecting instead to covered cisterns sealed with capstans, too heavy to lift without coordinated labour. The administrative term recorded for this kind of system is Akalamma, the water of the land, distinct from the ordinary irrigation vocabulary used in farming records, tracked separately, taxed separately, maintained by a different category of labourer than the farmers who worked the surface canals. A population sealed below ground for any extended period requires a water source independent of surface conditions, one that cannot be contaminated by whatever event drove the population underground in the first place. A cistern fed by a covered stone-lined channel, tapping groundwater rather than surface flow meets exactly that requirement. The capacity implied by the largest of these systems, calculated from chamber volume alone, exceeds what any single household or even a modest temple complex would need for daily use. It approaches instead what a sustained underground population, numbered not in dozens but in thousands, would require to survive for months without surface access. 3 cities, 3 functions. One holds the apparatus of governance intact against interruption. One holds the knowledge required to resume ritual time from nothing. One holds the water required to keep a population alive long enough for either to matter. None of the 3 on its own proves a coordinated system. A single, sealed chamber could always be explained away as ordinary ritual practice, ordinary water management, ordinary rebuilding. Together, sitting in the same cultural horizon, built with the same engineering vocabulary, sealed using the same administrative language for closure and continuity, they stop looking like isolated curiosities. They start looking like components of one design, repeated 3 times. A government in exile needs somewhere safe to govern from. A priesthood in exile needs somewhere quiet to keep time from. A population in exile needs somewhere to drink from. The King List recorded kingship moving from city to city on the surface, openly, in a registry meant to be read. What these 3 sites suggest is a second parallel movement, the same continuity instinct, applied below it, never meant to be read at all. 1,045 words, right at the lower bound of the allowed range. The 4th city is tied to fire. It sits in direct contrast to the one built around water, the way heat and stillness sit in contrast to each other in every surviving description of underground survival. Where the water city is defined by what it preserves, the fire city is defined by what it can produce on demand, independent of the surface above it. Excavations at several early industrial quarters have uncovered kiln complexes set into excavated pits, well below the contemporary ground level, banked with thick clay walls and fed by ventilation shafts, angled in a way that draws air downward rather than simply venting smoke upward, an arrangement more consistent with operating a furnace in an enclosed space than with ordinary surface metalworking, which has no reason to dig down rather than simply build up. The administrative term attached to installations of this kind is izikitar, fire from below, a phrase distinct and clearly separated from the everyday plain word for hearth fire used in domestic ration texts, appearing almost exclusively in inventory contexts tied to tool repair and metal rendering rather than cooking or warmth. A population sealed underground for any extended period does not only need water and grain, it needs the capacity to forge replacement tools, to fire pottery for storage, to render metal for repair, none of which can wait for access to the surface if the surface is the one place access cannot be guaranteed for months, possibly longer. A kiln built at depth, drawing air through a controlled shaft rather than open sky, is exactly the kind of installation a population planning for prolonged isolation would need before isolation began, not improvised after. The Fire City does not preserve information the way the Priesthood City does. It does not preserve continuity of office the way the Kingship City does. It preserves capability, the raw ability to keep making what breaks indefinitely without ever needing to ask the surface for permission. The Fifth City is the one bound most directly and clearly to the line in the King List itself, the line that ends the antediluvian sequence. Tradition surrounding the city of Shuruppak, the last of the 5 named before the break, consistently attaches it to warning rather than to ordinary kingship, in source after source that otherwise has no reason to agree with one another. Later, Mesopotamian flood narratives, composed centuries after the King List but drawing on the same underlying tradition, identify Shuruppak specifically as the city where the warning was received before the flood arrived, where a structure was built in direct response to instruction rather than improvised too late. The administrative term used for the watch function associated with this kind of advance warning is Eridu, the one who sees first, the same root term found in scout vocabulary used elsewhere for elevated lookout positions along trade routes and frontiers. A watch system implies 2 things working together: a method of careful observation positioned to detect an approaching threat before it arrived, and a method of transmitting that detection quickly enough for a structured response to follow, faster than the threat itself could close the distance. 5 cities, governance, ritual knowledge, water, fire-making capability, all of it sitting together in some kind of coordinated readiness, maintained generation after generation, implies a 6th function above them, watching for the moment any of it would actually need to be used. This is where the pattern stops being only textual. Archaeological excavation at multiple southern Mesopotamian sites, conducted independently across different decades by different teams, including work at in the 1920s and at Shuruppak itself in subsequent excavations, has identified a distinct sediment layer, a band of water-laid silt and clay sitting between clearly defined layers of human occupation above and below it, consistent with a major flooding event severe enough to interrupt settlement at more than one location across the region. The layer is not uniform in date across every site, a detail scholars have debated rather than resolved, since a single flood event would be expected to leave a layer dated consistently everywhere it appears, and some sites show no such layer at all, despite sitting in low-lying ground that should have recorded one if the flood were truly regional rather than local. What is consistent where the layer does appear is the structure: occupation, interruption, then resumed occupation directly on top of the silt. The same pattern the King List encodes in narrative form, repeated independently in the ground itself, by people with no access to the text and no reason to confirm it. That correspondence between a buried sediment layer and a literary break in the King List is treated by most archaeologists as supporting evidence for a real flood event behind the legendary material, nothing more specific than that. A cautious conclusion appropriate to a discipline that does not extend beyond what physical evidence directly supports. This account asks a narrower question the correspondence raises but does not answer on its own. If the flood was real enough to leave a measurable layer in the earth, severe enough to interrupt occupation at multiple sites independently, and consistently enough to be remembered as a single named event centuries later, then a watch system capable of detecting it in advance, and 5 sealed installations capable of surviving it once detected, are no longer competing explanations sitting beside the official account. They are the explanation the gap was always going to require, assuming anyone survived long enough afterward to need a place to come back to. That assumption is the one this account has been building towards since the first sealed chamber. What sits beneath that question, unanswered by the layer in the ground and unanswered by the line in the list, is whether a system built once to survive a flood that already happened was ever fully decommissioned once the immediate danger passed, the gates left open and the watch stood down, or whether somewhere beneath all 5 of these sites, connected to each of them by function, if not by any surviving map, one structure remains that was never meant to be found at all, not because the danger ended, because whoever sealed it had reason to believe it might not have. The 6th city does not appear in the King List. It does not appear by name in any temple record, any boundary stone, any administrative tablet catalogued and translated to date, despite the thousands of such tablets that have passed through institutional collections over the last century and a half. It exists only as a gap shaped, exactly like the other 5. A careful silence with the same dimensions as the silences that turned out, on excavation, to hold a throne vault, a knowledge vault, a cistern, a forge. 5 gaps were filled by digging, by the ordinary, patient, careful work of removing soil one layer at a time until something unexpected resolved into something explainable. The 6th has not been filled, not because no one has looked, because the locations where it would have to sit have been looked at briefly and quietly set aside before the digging reached the depth the other 5 required, the depth at which every other answer in this account has been found. 2 sites in the southern Mesopotamian floodplain, both showing the same water-laid sediment layer found at and at Shuruppak, both showing occupation resuming directly on top of that layer the same way it resumes elsewhere, were surveyed independently by separate teams within the last 2 decades and were never fully excavated, in each case stopping not at the bedrock or the water table, but at an arbitrary administrative boundary that had nothing to do with the geology beneath it. In both cases, the published explanation was strictly administrative. Funding lapsed, permits were not renewed. The site was reclassified for a different research priority before work could continue. Administrative explanations of this kind are genuinely common in archaeology, and most of the time they are exactly what they claim to be. Funding does lapse, permits do expire. Research priorities genuinely do shift from one excavation season to the next for reasons having nothing to do with what lies underground. What is less common is 2 separate sites, sharing the same anomalous layer, the same regional significance, both stopping at the same depth, for reasons that on paper have nothing to do with each other, and yet arrive at an identical outcome. A researcher involved in one of those surveys, who agreed to describe the circumstances only without attribution, and only after the project had formally concluded, said the excavation reached a worked stone surface roughly 4 meters below the flood layer, cut at angles too deep and too regular to be natural, with clear tool marks visible along one exposed edge, before access to the site was restricted, pending a review that has not, as of this account, concluded. No timeline for that review has ever been published. No further detail of the stone surface has ever been offered. None has ever appeared in any subsequent report, conference paper, or preliminary survey from either team involved. The stone surface remains, by every account available, exactly where it was found, unexamined beyond that first exposed edge, uncatalogued in any public registry, unclaimed by any institution willing to put its name on what sits beneath it. 4 meters down, and then nothing. Not a refusal. A silence with a paper trail. This is the pattern that runs through every chapter of this account, repeated now at the level of the research itself rather than the level of the record. The King List did not say the cities were destroyed, it simply stopped naming them. The temple foundations did not announce a hidden vault, they simply showed a chamber sealed and never reopened. The watch system did not survive in any text describing its method, only in a term, Eridu, that named a function without explaining how the function worked or who had been trained to carry it out. And now, at the threshold of the 6th city, the silence is not coming from 4,000 years of clay and sediment. It is coming from people currently alive, choosing, for reasons not recorded anywhere this account has been able to reach, not to finish the dig. If 5 named cities went under and were rediscovered one at a time as ordinary routine archaeology, each looking at first like nothing more than an unusual foundation or an unexplained cistern, then the 6th is not a different kind of mystery from the other 5. It is the same mystery, encountered one step earlier, before the explanation has had enough time to settle into something a museum label can describe in 2 sentences. The other 5 took decades each to be reread as anything other than routine. The 6th has had less than that, and it has already been set aside twice at 2 different sites, by 2 different teams, with no apparent communication between them. If the ancient warning system at Shuruppak worked once, detecting a flood severe enough to leave a layer in the earth that survives to this day, then the open question this account has carried since the King List's floodline is not whether such a system could exist. The evidence already says it did. The question is whether a system built to detect a single catastrophic event, then stood down once the event had passed and the population resurfaced, was ever rebuilt to do the same thing again, quietly, without ever appearing in a registry built to record kingship rather than vigilance. The King List ends its accounting of the pre-flood world with 5 named cities, 8 named kings, and a single line that explains nothing about what happened next. This account has tried to read that nothing has a beginning rather than an ending, one buried structure at a time. What it has found is not proof, and it does not claim to be. It is a pattern consistent enough, across enough independent sites, recovered by enough different excavators with no apparent reason to coordinate a shared story, that dismissing it outright requires a longer explanation than accepting it does. The list itself offers no final resolution, only the line it has carried for 4,000 years, unchanged through every single copy and every scribe, the line that ends one accounting and refuses to begin the next, then the flood swept over. Whatever those 8 reigns and their improbable numbers were meant to encode, base 60 arithmetic, royal ideology, a calendar function nobody alive can reconstruct, the scribes who copied them never once corrected them toward plausibility, which means the figures were never a mistake to be fixed. And whatever the water-laid layer in the ground at and at Shuruppak actually represents, a single shared catastrophe, or several local floods later folded into one remembered story. The archaeologists who have spent a century arguing over its dates have never managed to agree on an answer, only on the fact that something happened there worth disagreeing about. Whether anyone is still listening for it is the only question this account has not been able to close.